I think one of the hardest things to grasp when you're learning music production is how and when to use negative space. And for some reason, it seems like everyone's tendency is to just keep stacking things on top of each other when they're trying to make something feel full or professional. But in reality, I think the real magic or the vibe lies as much in what isn't there as what is. So let's take a peek behind the curtain at one of my own lo-fi tracks where I can show you a few examples of exactly how I use negative space to really capture the vibe I'm going for. So this is the project file for a song I dropped last year called Sunrise Meadow. And as you may be able to imagine from the name, I wanted to go for something really peaceful, calming, spacious. So jumping into this project, I already had the direction in mind. I knew what energy I was going for, and I thought sort of generally about what that energy might feel like, right? If we're thinking about calm, you don't think there's a whole lot going on around you, right? You don't think you're in a crowded, crazy room with a bunch of people yelling and screaming. You think that you've got peace, quiet, serenity, and then we try to build the parts to capture that energy specifically. So the approach I took was a really simple arpeggiated piano that isn't doing too much moving, and then a super simple bass line that literally is just whole notes on the roots of each chord. The drum groove matches the simplicity of the arpeggio, and then I've got a nice pad and Rhodes layered up to sort of round it out. So this was what the loop sounded like when I first sort of got a chord progression together. So I want you to notice the first example of negative space. It's probably a bit of a liberal use of the term in this case, but in this arpeggio, for example, the piano isn't moving the entire time. There's not a note strike every quarter note, every eighth note. It's really just going through 4 or 5 notes and then letting the chord ring out before moving on to the next chord. So that gap in between where there's motion and where more motion starts is sort of one way to think about one type of negative space. But of course, this was a little bit thin still, so I came up with a counter melody that has its own negative space that sort of dances with the arpeggiating piano here. So this is super simple, just basically a higher octave on a key mixed a little bit differently, but this is what I laid down next. So I think you can even visually appreciate that there are relatively large spaces. Our BPM is only 55, so 3 downbeats is, something like a little more than 3 full seconds where there's not something happening in the counter melody. So we're giving space in between major pieces of motion right in the initial loop because we know that the thing we're trying to capture is a sense of calm. So what I did here actually is copied this exact same intro basically over here, and then did what I probably would have done a couple years ago if I had this same idea for a track, where I think that beginner tendency to sort of crowd a melody or stack things up or make them a little bit more complicated than they need to be can end up obfuscating the energy you're going for. So really all I did was pop in and chop the arpeggio up so that there's a little bit more motion, and then similarly added some extra notes in the counter melody. I kept everything else the same drum, bass, and pad sound. And I think you'll hear that this sort of modified version of the loop still sounds good, but I don't think it sounds quite as calming as the initial loop that I actually ended up using. So let's take a listen to what the slightly more complicated beginner Luke probably would have done. So like I said, it still sounds good in my opinion. I think that this is a totally reasonable approach to making a lo-fi song, but I don't think that this is serving the purpose of making something that's really peaceful and spacious. So I hope that kind of makes sense. But perhaps the biggest bummer about this version of the loop is that it doesn't leave room for the thing that I think really gives this track its character, and that's the guitar part that I added. So let's take a listen coming out of the intro, and then I can talk you through some of the considerations I was using as I was thinking about where I wanted to use negative space here. So right away, I think you can visually appreciate that there's one different type of negative space in that I dropped out the hi-hat and the analog pad before the drop. So essentially what that's doing is creating a piece of contrast from what was playing and what is about to play. And this tiny moment, this half of a measure where there's just a little bit less going on, makes this drop where everything hits all at once feel that much bigger. So in that case, I took things away to make the next part feel a lot bigger. That's one type of negative space. But focusing more on the melodies, I want to talk about the guitar part a little bit and the way it's interacting with the piano melodies here. In particular, this seventh measure is a great example of giving space to what in this case is really the star of the song, right? The guitar is very much in the front. It's the thing that I wanted the ears to be drawn to, but I still didn't let myself overcomplicate it, right? So in the first two measures, there's a good bit of motion, there's a delay trailing off, but then there's literally a full measure and a half where there's absolutely no movement in the guitar. And what that's doing is giving space to let those piano melodies shine through and let the ears sort of like fall away from the focus on the guitar. So if I had some sort of riff or lick or walk down in this seventh measure, the energy wouldn't be ebbing and flowing. There wouldn't be this sense of spaciousness. There wouldn't necessarily be this sense of calm. It would be a little bit more chaotic, which would, if anything, take away from the vibe I'm going for. So one more time, let's listen to just how long the break is between the points where the guitar is actually doing something. So it's those little moments like that that you sort of let the attention and the energy ebb and flow between different parts within the song that really let you sort of capture the energy that you set out to capture. So now that we know what it sounded like in the actual arrangement, let's take a look back at our slightly more complicated loop to really show you that when you're overcomplicating the bass layers or when you're layering too many things, it can really sort of get in the way of capturing what I'm pretty happy with. I think it's a pretty nice vibe. I hope you feel the same. But let's hear same exact intro, all the same elements with our more complicated counter melody and our more complicated piano part. So perhaps you can see a bit of yourself or maybe your former self in this more complicated version. I know I certainly can. This is almost exactly what I would have been doing a few years ago, making this very same song. But I do hope this was a helpful rundown of how simplicity can really help breathe life into your tracks in a bit of a counterintuitive way. If you stuck around this long and you enjoyed the video, please think about hitting the subscribe button. I'm on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and it would mean so much if you'd be one of the first 1,000 people to hit that button. You're running out of time. Hit it now. All right, I'll see you guys next week. Peace. just gonna edit this in somewhere maybe.